The word antebellum means before the war, and postbellum means after the war. So, in this context, specifically, we're talking about the Civil War. So, the antebellum period is the 20 or so years before the Civil War, so the 1840s and 1850s. And over the next two lectures, we're going to be talking about this time period. This lecture, we're going to be focusing on the major events and trends during the antebellum period that did not have to do with slavery. And then next lecture, we're going to specifically focus on slavery and how that brought us towards the path to secession and eventually Civil War. So this section we can call Reform, Expansion, and Division because all of those things were happening in America in the 1840s and 1850s. The first thing to talk about is the Second Great Awakening. We've talked about the First Great Awakening already, which was during the colonial era, largely in New England and other northeastern states. And the Second Great Awakening was another period of religious revival, but this one during the 1830s and 1840s. Now, religious revivals really swept throughout the U.S., especially the North, in the early 1800s. And it was partly a reaction against the rationalism that had become very trendy in the late 1700s, kind of on the heels of the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, people setting aside faith and adopting a more reason-based worldview. So the reaction against that was to go back to religion, go back to spirituality. And Puritan teachings in particular, which are Calvinist teachings, had become less popular in America during this era that led up to the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening. Puritan teachings had become less popular in America, and more liberal theology like Unitarianism was growing. Unitarianism is the religious sect that says all paths lead to God. Calvinism's counterattack against these liberal views was called the Second Great Awakening. It's when you have various Protestant denominations growing and their influence becoming much more widespread, especially evangelical denominations like Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians, instead of the more mainline Protestant religions like the Anglican Church, the Congregationalist Church, etc. So this began among educated people. Specifically, it began at Yale University, where Yale's president, Reverend Timothy Dwight, held a series of campus revivals. And these revivals motivated a generation of young men to become evangelical preachers. Revivals then spread from Yale throughout the North, and preachers started to connect with the uneducated as well, where they didn't just go to Ivy League universities or even college towns. They went to rural districts. They talked to farmers. They talked to everyday common people and really started to connect with them on a deep level as well. And the main message of the Second Great Awakening was that salvation is for everybody. Salvation is available for all. And this was a message that was embraced by Americans who had become very democracy-minded. The idea that all are equal, we all deserve a fair say, no matter how much money we have or what family we come from. In 1823, Presbyterian minister Charles Finney started a series of revivals in upstate New York. Now, instead of delivering sermons based on rational argument, which had become the trend among many mainline Protestant denominations, Finney instead appealed to people's emotions. He would particularly appeal to people's fear of going to hell, and he was able to persuade thousands of people to publicly declare their revived faith, hence the term revival. And this is where things like the altar call started to come into tradition in American evangelicalism. Charles Finney preached that all people were free to be saved through faith and hard work. And these were ideas that strongly appealed to the rising middle class and the working class in America. That we are saved by faith, meaning anyone can have it, and we are saved by hard work, meaning if you work hard and earn it in that way, you can have it too. Because of Finney's influence, Western New York, really like Buffalo through Albany, became known as the burned over district because all throughout that region, preachers had been holding revivals, and it was called the Burned Over District because of all the frequent hellfire and brimstone sermons that were preached and the revivals that took place ensuing those sermons. Now, in the South and West, Baptist and Methodist preachers gained quite a few converts. While the Second Great Awakening was mostly a northern phenomenon, just like the First Great Awakening was, the exception would be the circuit preachers or the itinerant preachers. Those would be ministers who did not have one home congregation, but instead went from town to town, lived with people in those towns, and preached for a while, and then moved on to the next place. One example of a circuit preacher was Peter Cartwright. He would travel from one town to another, and he would attract thousands of people to hear his dramatic preaching. And the same was true with all of these itinerant preachers. And a lot of times they would do the preaching not inside church buildings, but at outdoor camp meetings where many more people could come and hear. They were able to convert a lot of the unchurched people into respectable members of the community. It really transformed a lot of people's social standing when they became Christians and became active in a church body. By 1850, Baptists and Methodists became the largest Protestant denominations in the U.S., and that was definitely not the case before the Second Great Awakening, but it still largely is the case today. Now, before the Second Great Awakening, the South was largely pagan. A lot of people don't realize this, but the North was the strictly religious part of the country, really up until the Second Great Awakening, right on the eve of the Civil War. Most Southerners, if they claimed religion at all, were not very devoutly practicing Christians. Things like the occult and interest in mythology were very common beliefs held among Southerners. One example of this is if you visit Andrew Jackson's mansion, which you can still visit today, his old plantation near Nashville, called the Hermitage. You see all these grand paintings that depict things from pagan mythology. You don't really see any kind of Christian paintings like you would expect, because nowadays we assume that the South was always the more religious place, because it is now. But up until this point in American history, the South was more the pagan place and the North was more the Christian place. That is why abolition really took roots in the North far earlier than it did in the South, because of the Christian roots. Now, during the entire history of the U.S. before the Civil War, the North was more devoutly Christian than the South, which is why most of the Second Great Awakening took place there. But you see that starting to change with the Baptist and Methodist itinerant preachers, certainly by the time we get to 1850. All right, now we get to Mormonism, another religious group called the Church of the Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, was founded by a man named Joseph Smith from upstate New York in 1830. So Smith claimed to have received a vision, a message, and he wrote down this message in what he called the Book of Mormon. Now, this message he claimed to be a New Testament, another New Testament of Jesus Christ that added more information about what is true regarding God. Now, he gained a fairly fast following among people in his town in upstate New York, but he and his followers were immediately persecuted due to them having beliefs that were very different from traditional Christianity. And because of that, they had to flee town after town. They had to move from New York to Ohio, and then from there they were driven out and settled in Missouri. From there they were driven out and settled in Illinois. And in Illinois, actually, Joseph Smith was killed by a local mob. They convicted him of being a charlatan, which is like a con man, and they killed him. And so the Mormons, from their very beginning, have been very highly persecuted. Brigham Young was the de facto leader of the Mormons after Joseph Smith was killed, and he led the Latter-day Saint community to the far western frontier, even past the Rocky Mountains. And this is where they established the New Zion, which was a community on the banks of the Great Salt Lake in modern-day Utah. They built a very strong, very self-sufficient community here, but those who left or threatened to leave did face potential danger. They faced potential danger at the hands of some of the more radical people in the Mormon faith, where you weren't. It wasn't seen as something you were free to do, to leave. The Mormon practice of polygamy also made the U.S. government hostile towards them. And in fact, when Utah applied to become a state, at first the U.S. government rejected them because of polygamy. And that's at the point where Mormons said that they received another vision, another message from God, and said that polygamy was no longer okay. So they banned it, and then they became a state. Now, much of the religious enthusiasm of this time was based on something called millennialism. This is the widespread belief that the world was about to come to an end very soon with the second coming of Christ. The preacher William Miller, in particular, gained a lot of followers. In fact, he gained tens of thousands of followers by predicting the date when Jesus would come back. Now, of course, the Bible says no one knows the day or the hour that the Son of Man will return, and yet throughout much of Christian history, you've had people predicting when the second coming will be. Every time so far, it has been incorrect, including this very famous time when William Miller said that Jesus would come back on October 21st, 1844. Miller's followers were quite disappointed, of course, when that didn't happen, but they still stuck strong, most of them did, to their convictions, and established the church today known as Seventh-day Adventists. The Second Great Awakening, much like the first, caused new divisions in society, divisions mostly between newer so-called evangelical churches, like Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and older, more mainline Protestant churches, as they're called, things like Anglicanism and things like Church of England, Congregationalists, etc. Now, throughout the North, from Massachusetts to Ohio, this revived sense of religiosity really inspired people to advocate for all sorts of social reform, from temperance to women's rights to the creation of public asylums and public schools, all the way to the abolition of slavery. Now, we'll get to the abolition movement in our next lecture, but for this one, I want to focus on the first four I just mentioned, starting with temperance. So temperance basically means intentionally refraining or abstaining from temptations or vices of any sort. In this particular sense, it's talking about alcohol. So from the 1820s to the 1850s, millions of Christians advocated for temperance. They said that alcohol is the cause of many social ills, and they had some evidence for that, actually. Approximately half of all violent crime was committed by people who were under the influence of alcohol. And so the thought was that if people stopped drinking, then society would become more Christian. So you have millions of Christians putting away the booze. You have them trying to get people to stop drinking alcohol. And a society formed called the American Temperance Society. It was founded in 1826. And really those who were most opposed to this temperance movement, which seems kind of harmless, but some people who were very opposed to it were immigrants from Germany and Ireland. Now, 13 states and many individual cities and counties actually banned the production and sale of alcohol altogether. And this is long before the famous prohibition of the 1920s. This is nearly 100 years before that time, but here this is really the first temperance movement. Going on to the reform of asylums, a woman named Dorothea Dix advocated for mental hospitals. She said that mental health is a huge issue, which she's right, and she said because of that, we need hospitals to care for these poor individuals who are very misunderstood by society and need compassion just as much as people with broken legs do. She also supported state-supported prisons instead of privately run prisons, which could be run for profit. She supported poorhouses and schools for the deaf and the blind. And a lot of that exists nowadays is due to originally these social reformers from the Antebellum period. The public education movement was really driven by a guy named Horace Mann. He led what he called the Common School movement, which advocated for public schools. and also advocated for compulsory school attendance laws for children, meaning made it mandatory for children to go to school under truancy laws. He also advocated for a longer school year. School years were often cut short because of planting season and harvesting season and bad weather and things like that. And he also advocated for increased teacher training. He said that teachers should be trained better because the smarter the teacher is, the more equipped the teacher is, the better off the students will be too. Williams Holmes McGuffey added to this common school movement a moral education movement. He wrote a series of primers or books on moral education, and these taught kids the virtues and values of things like hard work and sobriety and punctuality. Then in 1848, a group of feminists met at Seneca Falls, New York, and this was the first women's rights convention in U.S. history. Some notable suffragettes, as they were called, because they advocated for women's suffrage, which means the right to vote. That would be Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, etc. And they led the campaign for equal voting rights for women, equal legal rights for women, and equal property rights for women. Going to the topic of literature and philosophy, one of the burgeoning philosophies of this antebellum period was called transcendentalism, trying to transcend the material world. And in particular, New England became very enraptured with this new idea of transcendentalism. New England writers began to question organized religion altogether. This is kind of on the cusp, or not on the cusp, on the right after the Second Great Awakening. And they also started to question capitalism, two things that America had kind of been founded upon. Organized religion and capitalism were questioned by the transcendentalists. They argued for a more mystical and intuitive way of thinking, trying to look within yourself and looking to your feelings instead of to rationalism or to sacred texts. And they said that this is the best way to discover one's inner self, to discover truth, to basically look for the essence of God in yourself and also in nature, rather than in rational arguments and in the Bible. And they claimed artistic expression was more important than material wealth and prosperity. Now, these ideas that collectively were known as transcendentalism was highly individualistic. It was not corporate, meaning it wasn't about communities. It was all about the individual, the belief that people should be self-reliant, should look within themselves for what is their truth, instead of coming together as a community around one sacred text. And it viewed organized institutions, whether they were churches or secular institutions, as largely unimportant. And they kind of said the individual is everything. And this is where American individualism comes from. America is a very individualistic society, and that can have both good and bad connotations. Transcendentalists supported a lot of the social reforms I just mentioned, but they especially supported abolition. A couple examples of transcendentalists would be Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Emerson, in particular, was an essayist. He was a lecturer, and he expressed the individualistic, self-reliant mood of the period, the idea that we should be our own men or our own women and not find our identity in groups. He also urged Americans not to imitate European culture, but rather to create an entirely new and original American culture. He prided himself as being an independent thinker or a free thinker. Then Henry David Thoreau was a close friend of Emerson's, and they actually lived in the same town, Concord, Massachusetts. And in order to put his transcendentalist philosophy to the test, Thoreau conducted a 2-year experiment where he went off into the woods outside Concord and lived by himself for 2 years. Now, he went into town from time to time, but he lived out there by himself. He built his own house and lived by a lake and just lived a very simplistic life out in nature. He was a naturalist, meaning he observed nature and tried to learn as much as he could about it. And he believed that observing nature would help people find essential truths about life and the universe. And you can read about his experience in the book Walden, which he wrote because he He lived right along Walden Pond in Massachusetts. Thoreau also advocated for peaceful protests, and he demonstrated this when he refused to pay what he considered to be an immoral tax, a tax that would have supported the American war with Mexico, something we'll talk about in a minute. And he, in fact, spent a night in jail for his refusal to pay this tax. And he wrote an essay on it called On Civil Disobedience, and this inspired both Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King in the century to come. The idea of disobeying laws peacefully and civilly in order to make a statement that a law is unjust. The idea of withdrawing from society and kind of creating a utopia for yourself was later tried out on larger scales. So yes, the transcendentalists were very individualistic, but still most of America was communal, lived amongst large groups of people, found their identity in groups instead of just on their own. And so this concept of withdrawing from society to create a utopia was tried out on larger scales. A couple examples of this would be the Shakers. That was one of the earliest religious communal movements. The Shakers had about 6,000 members in various communities around the 1840s. They held property in common, and they kept women and men strictly separate. In fact, they forbid both marriage and sex, which means they died out pretty quickly. They couldn't get many people to recruit, and because they were not having any more children, they died out within a century. Another communal experiment was the Amana settlements. This was founded in Iowa by German pietists, people who were kind of similar to Puritans and Calvinists, and they were very much dedicated to an ascetic life, which means a simple life, not chasing carnal pleasures, but taking pleasure in the simple, God-given joys of life. But they did allow for marriage, which ensured their survival. So the Amana settlements lasted a lot longer than the Shakers. One final example is the Oneida community in New York. They shared property and they shared spouses. So that was very different from the Shakers and from the Amana settlements. And in fact, the Oneida community was condemned as a sinful experiment in free love. The Oneida community is very similar to the hippie communes of the late 1960s. This is a time when American literature really came into its own. Fiction authors started to create a literature at this time that was distinctly American. That was very different from European literature, which 18th century American literature had been based upon. I got 4 examples for you. First would be Washington Irving. He wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is a uniquely American tale that takes place just north of New York City, maybe 100 miles north or so in upstate New York, in a small town called Sleepy Hollow, where this itinerant teacher named Ichabod Crane comes, and it's a very charming tale. It's depicted in animated form in a very old Disney movie from the 1940s. Bing Crosby is the voice. It's fantastic, but it's a really good short story as well. James Fenimore Cooper wrote a trilogy of novels about Indians and frontiersmen. The books are called The Deerslayer, The Pathfinder, and The Last of the Mohicans. And The Last of the Mohicans, in particular, was a very, very famous book. Nathaniel Hawthorne questioned the intolerance and conformity in American life in his book, The Scarlet Letter. That's the famous story of a woman who commits adultery, has a child, and therefore is forced to wear a scarlet letter A on her clothing so everyone knows that she's a sinner. And then Herman Melville reflected on cultural conflicts, man versus nature, man versus man, in his classic tale, Moby Dick. All right, the idea of manifest destiny is something that very much pervaded the American psyche in the 1840s in particular. And this was the idea that it was the God-given right of Americans to spread out all across North America, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and that Americans had a divine right to settle that land for themselves, to take it from Native Americans and stretch out from sea to shining sea, as it was called. Part of the accomplishment of manifest destiny was acquiring Texas. So Texas was not a part of the Western land given with the Louisiana Purchase. It was acquired separately. And to understand this, it goes back to the Texas Revolution of the 1830s. This was when U.S. colonists living in Texas, which was a part of Mexico at the time, rebelled against the Mexican government and the Mexican president, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. So American colonists move into Texas, stirred up trouble, rebelled against the Mexican president in an attempt to bring Texas into the United States. The Battle of the Alamo was the most famous battle of this war. It took place in 1836 in modern-day San Antonio. And Texas eventually succeeded in breaking free from Mexico, and they established the Republic of Texas. And this country, as it was for a number of years, was later annexed by the United States in 1845, and it became the 28th state. But for about 9 years, Texas was its own country. It was its own republic, and then it became a U.S. state. So a big question at the time was, should the U.S. annex Texas? Should it become a state, or should it remain its own country? Well, at the heart of this controversy was slavery, just like slavery was at the heart of most American controversies from this time. But because slavery was allowed in Texas, a lot of Northerners did not want to annex it because that would add to the number of slave states in America, and that would also add to the number of congressmen that slave states got in the U.S. House of Representatives. So the pro-slavery Democratic Party and most Southerners knew that the annexation of Texas, which they supported because it would expand slavery, they knew that its annexation would depend on who won the presidential election of 1844. So they nominated somebody who they believed could bring the party together, North and South, and his name was James K. Polk of Tennessee. He was a protege of Andrew Jackson. He was sold as kind of going to be the next Andrew Jackson, and he was firmly committed to westward expansion and manifest destiny. He said he was going to work as hard as he could to expand U.S. territory westward to accomplish manifest destiny. And he actually did. In just 4 short years, he almost doubled the size of the United States. Now, due to the expansionist mood, both of Westerners and Southerners and some Northerners, Polk won the election of 1844, became the 11th president of the United States. And when he won, Democrats interpreted this election victory as basically a mandate to add Texas to the United States, which they did. And that's when Texas became the 28th state. Now, during Polk's presidency, which was only 4 years, the U.S. acquired the entirety of the West, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This is going to seem unrelated until I connect it, but stick with me for a second. The cotton gin. All right, everyone learns in grade school that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, but what else do we know about it? Why was it actually important? Well, it was a very significant development of the market revolution because not only did it increase production and lead to more profit for some, but it also increased slavery. Now, remember, the founding fathers believed that slavery would die out. That was their hope. And while that was actually starting to happen towards the late 1700s, slavery was getting less and less, that trend completely switched in the early 1800s, and that was all because of the cotton gin. Before the cotton gin, slavery had become fairly unprofitable, and so people were transitioning away from it. But now with the cotton gin, this can strip the seeds out of cotton bolls, and that makes it much easier to spin it into thread, yarn, cloth. And because of that, cotton farming became much more tenable, much more feasible, much more profitable. But you need people to pick that cotton. It's a very labor-intensive crop. It's not something that you can just plant, water, and wait for it to grow. It takes a lot of care throughout the season, and especially when cotton picking season comes. So tragically, the introduction of the cotton gin actually led to an increase in slavery, so much so that by the time of the Civil War, the number of slaves in America was 4 million, whereas at the time of the Revolutionary War, 80 years earlier, it was only 500,000. The Mexican War is it was the next step towards manifest destiny. This war between the U.S. and Mexico was really caused by a dispute over the boundaries of Texas. So in 1845, the U.S. acquired Texas, it became a state. Okay, but then there was a debate about where is the border of Texas? Where does it stop being Texas and start being Mexico? Well, both sides could not agree. So this boundary dispute led to war. Now, first, President Polk offered to purchase the disputed territory from Mexico, but the Mexican government refused, and so Polk sent in troops. This is very similar to how earlier presidents dealt with Indian land. They first offered to buy the land, and if they did, they found a peaceful settlement and acquired the land. But if the Indians refused, they then sent in the military to defeat them. So Polk sent in the troops into the disputed territory, and these troops, led by future President Zachary Taylor, was a victory for the U.S. The war lasted about 2 years and was a decisive American victory. And in fact, a lot of the both Union and Confederate generals that we would see in the Civil War were young captains and lieutenants during this war 15 years earlier. The Mexican-American War ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the terms of this treaty were very, very beneficial for America, not so good for Mexico. Now, the U.S. agreed to pay Mexico $15 million for damages caused by the war. And that's certainly something, but at the same time, what America got was much more. Mexico was forced to give up a third of its land to the U.S. So all of that area on the map in the color used to be Mexico. It was a part of Spain, but then it was a part of Spanish territory, but then when Mexico declared independence from Spain and won independence from Spain, it became part of Mexico. But now in 1848, that land in the light green there, what's the modern-day southwest of the U.S., became American land, and it was forcibly handed over by Mexico. And so this dramatically increased the size of the United States. The entirety of what we now know of as the Southwest it became a part of the U.S. That includes New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, not to mention the portion of Texas that was under dispute. And the Rio Grande became the new border of the U.S. and Mexico. So final slide here, manifest destiny. Where do we lie right now? Well, looking at this map here, the Louisiana Purchase, that goes all the way back to 1803 when Jefferson purchased that from Napoleon. Okay, well then we get Texas, this entire territory in the light blue, when we annexed them in 1845, then fought the Mexican-American War, that became American land. Then we have this massive area in the white, that was the Mexican Cession, which was a part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo after the Mexican-American War. That became America. And then you have these smaller territories that became ours bit by bit. And then now, in 1846, which is at the same time that the Mexican-American War is going on, the U.S. acquires the Oregon Territory, which is modern-day Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, plus parts of Montana and Wyoming. And this territory was purchased from the British with the Oregon Treaty of 1846. No bloodshed, but all that became American territory. So things that led to the rapid population growth in the newly acquired Western territories was mostly things like the gold rush. So gold was found in California the very year that California became a part of the United States, 1848. And so the next year, 1849, people rush out to California to see how much gold they can get. That's why the San Francisco football team is called the 49ers, because in 1849, that's when the prospectors rushed to see if they could strike it rich. So thousands of people moved west in order to get rich from gold. Also, many of them moved west because the land was cheaper out there and it was available and it was able to be farmed. So once this massive amount of land was acquired, once this was added to the nation, really one question remained. One question really came to dominate American politics, and that was, would slavery be allowed in the West. We knew it was not allowed in the North. We knew it was allowed in the South. But what about the West? Remember, those are the three sections. Remember the sectionalism crisis. And of course, Southerners want it to exist in the West. They want it to expand. Northerners do not want it to exist in the West. They want the West to be free. So all of this ended up making the Civil War inevitable. Slavery combined with the Western expansion and the acquisition of new land, where the question was, will we have slavery out West?